Welcome everyone to the webinar on planning for spontaneous disaster volunteers today. My name's Blythe McLennan. I'll be moderating the webinar. And for people who don't know me, I'm a researcher at RMIT University and I do research for the Bushfire and Natural Hazards Cooperative Research Centre around emergency volunteering. And I'm a convener of the Emergency Volunteering Shared Learning Network, through which this webinar today has been organised. So today's webinar is 1 hour long. We'll have a presentation from our speakers for about 30 minutes and then we'll have a time for question and answers at the end. And we'll be finishing at 4 o'clock East Coast time. So I'm very pleased to introduce our two presenters today, Amanda Nixon and Katherine Green, who are both from Volunteering Queensland. So Amanda is the Senior Manager for Projects for Volunteering Queensland. She manages Volunteering Queensland's EV crew service that many of you will be familiar with, and the natural disaster resilience projects that Volunteering Queensland have currently. And across that portfolio area, there's a large focus on volunteers and how they can be activated, utilised and managed before, during and after a disaster event. Katherine is a Senior Project Officer for the Natural Disaster Resilience Program project, the NDRP project at Volunteering Queensland. And she works closely with 5 councils that are participating in that project to identify the best possible model that can be used in their community for the management of spontaneous volunteers. And that includes mapping the council and local community groups and organisations' capacity to undertake that task. And so Amanda and Katherine will be speaking to their experiences in those areas. So I will hand you over to the speakers. Let me turn their microphone back on so that they can talk to you. Okay, I'll just let people know as well. So Amanda and Katherine had these lovely slides prepared and something didn't quite work in the conversion in the webinar platform. So there's a couple of bits where it looks a bit rough. That was not in their original slides. So I'll just give you a link to get a copy of their PDF slides at the end as well. And you'll see that they're very nicely put together. So sorry for that, Amanda and Katherine. But over to you. So yep, you now have hold of the slides.
Thank you. Hi everyone, thanks for the invitation to present information on spontaneous disaster volunteers. Because we've already been introduced so nicely by Blythe, we won't go into any further detail about Katherine and myself, but today Katherine and I will both be presenting information, so we will be taking it in turns. At this point in time, we're probably only, our noses are probably only about 10 centimetres away from the speaker on our laptop. So if you do have problems with hearing us, please let us know and we'll move as close as we possibly can. Today the information that we're going to be presenting is going to have a strong focus. It's going to be talking a lot about the Queensland, about spontaneous volunteering in Queensland within a Queensland disaster management context, and you'll hear us often we'll be often referring to working with councils and within Queensland. Within Queensland, we play a significant role in terms of the Queensland disaster management arrangements. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Okay, so. Great. So today we're going to provide you with a bit of an overview on spontaneous volunteering. We'll talk a bit about, really briefly, on our role in Queensland, why we need to plan for the management of spontaneous volunteers. We'll also share with you a little bit of information about emerging models that we're seeing for the management of spontaneous volunteers, and then we'll go into the planning considerations that we propose or suggest that needs to occur. Okay, so we think within our role, we often get asked what a spontaneous volunteer is. So for us, a spontaneous volunteers are those people who have no formal association with the emergency management system, but they put their hands up to help when a disaster happens. This type of volunteer normally assists in the few weeks following a disaster event or as the event is unfolding. The support that they provide is normally time limited. Their motivations are normally driven or as a result of traditional and social media coverage, and they may or may not have relevant training, skills or experience. So you will have a variety of different people coming from different walks of life offering to help. There are multiple benefits in using spontaneous volunteers at times of disasters. These range from economic. So at the moment, we calculate the contributions of spontaneous volunteers at $42.25 per hour, and that's based on ABS data. Other organisations might allocate a different price to that, but for Volunteering Queensland, it's $42.25. We also know that volunteering is an attribute of a resilient community. Volunteering increases social connectivity and it also encourages the identification of collective strategies for preparedness and recovery activities. We also can see that volunteering reduces the demand on already stretched resources. So when we talk about the demand, we're talking about, particularly for local volunteers, they reduce the demand and the requirement for them to be accommodated, for them to have vehicles to be able to get there. There's a whole range of benefits there that they bring. In terms of what roles spontaneous volunteers can undertake, that's certainly a question that we're getting more and more, we're being asked more and more here in this project. And while we can see that the spontaneous volunteers may, a lot of the time they might play a role in terms of clean-up and debris removal, the reality is that we're seeing spontaneous volunteers can be used for a variety of roles. That may include administrative support. They might also include things such as meet and greet activities or even door knocking. So it really does depend on what the need is of the community and what their skill set is. So just to give you a brief understanding of who we are and what we do before we jump into the detail of planning for spontaneity, Volunteering Queensland is the peak body for volunteering, developing and advocating for the interests of all volunteers and the organisations that involve them. So in short, what this actually means is we know stuff about volunteers, and particularly in Queensland. So within Queensland, we provide a variety of roles in a disaster context. So on the screen, you'll see that we provide capacity building, EV crew operations, volunteer coordination, training and professional development, as well as run a variety of projects. So today, we will provide more of an overview on EV crew operations and the projects, because a lot of our work is aligning to that space. So for those of you that don't know, Volunteering Queensland has a formal role within the Queensland Disaster Management Arrangements, and that is Queensland Government purchases or utilises EV crew for the registration process of spontaneous volunteers. So volunteers are normally referred there. It's a spot where an online portal where people can register their interest to volunteer at times of disasters. And then we will normally match them with recognised organisations that require assistance at times of disaster events. The benefit of EV Crew is it can actually register large numbers of volunteers quickly and for utilisation almost immediately. EV Crew is a one-stop shop and provides a consistent point for volunteers to register their interest across our state. And Volunteering Queensland sends groups of volunteers to formal organisations. However, we only send the volunteers that they require. So this is the benefit is we might have 500 people register their interests, but in reality the community only requires 50, so we will only send 50 people to the organisation that requires the assistance, and that stops the organisations having to deal with the influx of massive numbers of volunteers should they be faced with that. In terms of our projects, Volunteering Queensland, we actually have a long-standing history of delivering projects with a focus on volunteering at times of disasters as well as building resilience. The most recent projects that we've implemented have a strong focus on building council and community organisations' capability to manage spontaneous volunteers. So again, within the Queensland disaster management arrangements, and Katherine will touch on this again, within Queensland, councils have the role for the planning for the management of spontaneous volunteers. The key work to date within the project has focused on identifying a number of models for the management of spontaneous volunteers. It's focused on mapping, so we do map the capacity and interest of local community organisations and groups. We've developed and delivered training for team leaders of spontaneous volunteers, and we're in the process now of developing standard operating procedures and exercises for these councils to support them in their processes. Today we're going to be sharing with you our learnings from our most recent experiences, as well as some examples of how these models are applied in a Queensland context. So just a bit of an overview for this project team. We do have a set of key principles that we always keep at the forefront of our mind with the work that we do. Number one is that communities and volunteers will mobilise at times of disasters to help their community. Whether we're ready or not, they are going to be there. Volunteering will always enhance social capital and community resilience. Volunteers and their activities require coordination and management that can feed into the local arrangements. We also see that local organisations and groups are a valuable resource, and locally led responses should always be looked at in the first instance. However, in saying that, we also embrace those external organisations, so that they are those organisations that may not have strong local ties or relationships or memberships in the community. However, we recognise that they can provide valuable support and resources where local capacity and capability is limited. And we also see that they do have positive outcomes when they're working in partnership with the local community. The other thing that we do here is we use national and international research and best practice at all times, and we're applying action learning, which means that we're constantly modifying and evolving our new learnings.
Thank you for that, Blythe. So this video is a stark reminder to us that despite volunteers' best interests at heart, the realities can be far from desirable without proper planning. And a lot of these issues that we can see that popped up in this video, I think they could be minimised with the proper coordination and management. So spontaneous disaster volunteers will turn up to most disasters, whether you're prepared or not. And now we have the ability to self-organise into large groups through online platforms such as Facebook. So the objective of the work that we do in planning for disasters is to ensure that proper management and coordination of volunteers can provide a good experience to both the community and the volunteers. Now we get asked a lot, what is the difference between coordination and management of spontaneous disaster volunteers? And we like to describe the coordination of volunteers as the umbrella that looks after all the volunteering activities in a particular region affected by a disaster. The management of volunteers is by the individual organisations that look after that day-to-day operational management of their volunteers. For example, let's take an event where there are multiple organisations managing volunteers. The coordinator would sit in the local disaster coordination centre and be responsible for that overall coordination of all volunteers from multiple groups. For example, it could be the Lions Club, the Rotary Club, or even councils themselves. The operational management of volunteers may be done through these multiple groups. They would then all be coordinated through that central coordinator in the local disaster coordination centre, who may be from one of the larger organisations, so it may be council that then is the coordinator. The coordinator are not responsible for the insurances related to each volunteer or organisation being tasked, unless they are also responsible for the management of those volunteers. They do ensure the available resources are available and used effectively to meet specified objectives of the operation. They may task a range of groups to undertake various activities. And unless otherwise identified, individual volunteers are not directed by the coordinator. The coordinator ensures groups and organisations have the necessary information to meet their objectives. On the other hand, the operational management of volunteers, they are directly responsible for the insurance of volunteers that they are managing. So spontaneous volunteers are directly tasked by those managers, and those managers often take the form of a team leader. The direct supervision of spontaneous volunteers is provided by the organisation managing them, and that organisation ensures spontaneous volunteers have necessary information to meet their objectives. So this may be things such as workplace health and safety information and job details. So as Amanda said before, when we look at these emerging models, we are looking at it with a very Queensland-focused lens. So Queensland planning for spontaneous disaster volunteers lies with the local government, and hence we are engaging heavily with local government and their communities. So in the past, in the last few years, Volunteering Queensland has been looking at a range of projects, and out of those projects have evolved 3 models for the management of disaster volunteers. And so those models is a council-led model, so that can include their staff and their volunteers. And the second model is one external organisation is responsible for the management of those spontaneous volunteers. And thirdly, multiple groups may work together in a consortium that then look after and manage those spontaneous disaster volunteers on the ground. For the purposes of this presentation, we will be primarily discussing management. However, recognise that coordination is equally important. And when we start going a bit more into these models, you'll see where the coordination aspects will fit into it. Although in our current project, we are seeing that the models evolve. So each council is looking at one of these 3 different models, but what's coming out is quite a different version for each council, and it's really interesting to see that some of them can be quite different even within the same model. It should be mentioned that multiple models can be utilised depending on the scale of the event. So for example, one council is looking at a scalable approach where they may utilise their own volunteers first in a localised event, and then get another organisation or multiple organisations if the event becomes more widespread. So I'll now give you a little bit more of a breakdown about each model, and Amanda will give you some examples about the models that have been utilised already or that have been currently discussed. So model 1, so this was the council-led model. This means that council is solely responsible for the management and coordination of those spontaneous disaster volunteers. And so council's workforce would be utilised in this model, and they would be the team leaders that are managing volunteers on the ground. And as I said before, council then is responsible for both the coordination and the management in this model. It may or may not include the use of spontaneous volunteers. So we have seen some councils that do have a strong volunteer workforce are looking at how they can integrate their own volunteer workforce into the models without needing the use of spontaneous volunteers in a small event. Community members also may be utilised as a council model, in the council model, and Amanda will talk a bit more about that a bit later. They would come under council's insurances and council's banner as a council volunteer in this instance. And the big one is that council would then be solely responsible for the insurance for both their volunteers, their workforce, and also for the spontaneous volunteers. Now Now the strength in this model is that in small events that where they do not require large numbers of volunteers, this can be quite useful. And especially in some of the smaller councils, the council often is one of the larger workforces in the community. One of the challenges that we do see that it can be quite resource intensive for councils. So they will need to actively engage with their internal workforce on a regular basis. And another challenge may be that they have limited ability to respond to large events due to access to existing resources, which actually may need to be pulled into other business areas of the organisation. So I hand over to Amanda now, and she'll give you a couple of examples that have utilised Model 1 or are in discussions at the moment.
So for the examples I'm going to provide, some of the examples I'll give you a little bit more information around the name of the council, and that's because we can see they're well established and we've had conversations with the council about sharing that level of information. In other instances, there may not be as much information. We can provide you with an overview of what we're seeing emerge, but there's not necessarily, because some of these councils are currently involved in the projects, and we're still refining those processes with them, that we're it's still a work in progress, so we won't be able to provide you with clear information. However, if you do want additional information from us, please let us know, and then we can engage with those councils and seek their permission to progress that way. So in terms of the diagrams here, so we just want to highlight that the diagrams were developed in the previous project, and we can also already see room for improvement with these diagrams. So particularly for the red circle that you can currently see on your screen, just keep in mind that that red circle is more about Volunteering Queensland's role. So if you could just sort of remove that a little bit and just look at the blue, yellow and the green circles for the time being, you'll see how that works. So in terms of the yellow circle, that's more about the coordination level, and that would normally sit at the Local Disaster Coordination Centre and with the Local Disaster Management Group. And then the team leader is the person or persons within the council that are leading those spontaneous volunteers on behalf of council. So some of the examples that we actually have here is the community champions. Now, within South East Queensland, we have a council called Redland Council, and they have worked very closely with a number of community members on some of the smaller islands that can be isolated for a few days at times of big events. And council have established a model where they have approached community members to take on a key role within their community to support the preparedness of disasters in that community, but also support the response and the recovery. And some of that, the way that community champions may be utilised is they will establish an evacuation centre in their community. So council has organised training with Red Cross to provide that training, and Volunteering Queensland has also provided training in the management of spontaneous volunteers. So those community champions sit under council's insurance, but I do believe there's also some work that they do on behalf of Red Cross, and they sit under their model as well. We're also seeing other councils explore ways that they can use a mix of council staff. So when I say a mix of council staff, that includes paid and unpaid staff or volunteers. So they're currently exploring how they can utilise those paid and unpaid staff to support a pretty quick response, particularly in smaller events, and those volunteers and staff may be able to also take on the management of spontaneous volunteers. And again, that council is solely responsible for the insurance and the management of everything that happens there. We do know some councils have larger numbers of volunteers that are already assisting our council in the day-to-day operations. So some councils may have a workforce of maybe 1,500 spontaneous volunteers. So it is, I think, something that a lot of councils are currently looking into about not everyone, but some councils are looking into ways that they can utilise their workforce to support.
Thanks, Amanda. So our second model, as mentioned before, is that one organisational group is responsible for the management of volunteers. So that organisational or group, their workforce would be utilised as the team leaders who are directly responsible for that management. And it may or may not include coordination at a central point. So because it is just one organisation, to have a coordinator, they would then sit in the Local Disaster Coordination Centre to be able to give that information of the overall overarching coordination down to their organisation on the ground that's managing them. This organisation or group may focus on just one activity, or it actually may be a range of activities, depending on the organisation and how versatile they are. This organisational group in this model is solely responsible for the insurance. And that, as I said before, that includes their own workforce, their own volunteers, and the spontaneous disaster volunteers. The strength of this model is that it's useful for large, versatile and flexible organisations, especially those with a large volunteer workforce. Excuse me. But one of the challenges is the ability to meet demands of medium to large events can be limited. At this stage, we've not been able to identify one single organisation that has the capacity to manage an entire local government area in a widespread event. And once again, one of the challenges here being the potential cost of insurance. It can be quite a lot for one organisation to take on board, especially if there were a large number of volunteers. So I hand over to Amanda to give you some examples.
So we'll head straight into the examples, and again I just want to highlight with the EV crew, you'll probably see there you will see the EV crew model. The red circle is pointing direct to the coordinator. That actually wouldn't be the case. Volunteering Queensland don't refer to the coordinator, we refer direct to the organisation that's looking after the volunteers, and that will be responsible for the volunteers. So some of the models that we have seen emerge within Queensland is, so again we want to again highlight that's one organisation responsible for the management of spontaneous volunteers, is the Conservation Volunteers Australia have entered into an arrangement with a small rural council. Within that particular council area, we did do an assessment. We went in and we undertook a capability assessment of our community organisations and groups. And at that point in time, we couldn't really find anybody, there were people interested, but there were a few stumbling blocks for those organisations, such as insurance, and they just needed a bit more time to be trained up and so on. But we could see that Conservation Volunteers Australia had a strong relationship already in the community in terms of some of the work it was doing, and it was already utilising its local community were engaging with them, as well as Conservation Volunteers Australia already had an established relationship with Council. So Conservation Volunteers Australia in this instance is not a locally based organisation. They are a drive-in, drive-out model, and they have limited capacity, so they wouldn't be able to provide 50, 60 team leaders at any one time. They can only provide small numbers, so they're quite useful in terms of a small disaster event until additional support can come in. But at the moment, Conservation Volunteers is the main organisation that are being utilised, and there is a MOU in place for that. We also can see that Global Care Australia has entered into an agreement with a regional council within Southeast Queensland, and that organisation of course will be providing the insurance for their volunteers. They provide team leaders, so they've got a greater resource, and a lot of their team leaders are actually locally based, so so they would be pulling from their local resources, their team leaders, and those people are being skilled up in the management of spontaneous volunteers, and they would be the primary organisation to oversee that. I'm going to jump from across Queensland Government for the time being and talk a bit about Team Rubicon Australia. So we also know Team Rubicon Australia have entered into some MOUs with councils. One of them recently was Townsville, and what we know has occurred there is Team Rubicon played a significant role in that community with taking on spontaneous volunteers and doing muck and gut and debris removal, mould remediation. There was a whole heap of activities they were undertaking there. We know that because of the nature of the Townsville community, there was a mixture of local Team Rubicon members and fly-in, fly-out people within that mix. So now that I'm going to jump back to Queensland Government also utilised spontaneous volunteers in the Townsville experience. Now, before we talked briefly about Model 3, which is a consortium of organisations, the reason why we're still highlighting Queensland Government and Team Rubicon Australia as two separate entities really, and we've included them in Model 2, is because they were working in relative isolation. So there wasn't a central coordination point for all the volunteer activities. They were more focusing on the volunteers that fell within their certain areas, so there wasn't a lot of negotiation at that level. So that's why we've highlighted them separately. Queensland Government utilised volunteers for a very different purpose, and that was for the small business. They had a small business resource centre, and that's when they utilised volunteers to be able to meet and greet people coming in to the Small Business Recovery Centre, and those volunteers played a significant role in terms of pulling information together for their community.
So moving on to Model 3, this is our final model, and this model looks at a consortium of groups. So this is a range of organisations that utilise their own team leaders for the management of spontaneous volunteers. So individual organisations are responsible for the management of the volunteers that are assigned to them, and obviously their own volunteers. One organisation may be responsible for the central coordination of volunteers, and if we look at most examples, it would be that larger organisation that has the capacity to act in that central coordination role. Individual organisations are also each responsible for the insurances of their volunteers. So any volunteer under them that's an affiliated volunteer, and any spontaneous volunteer that is being tasked directly by them, they are responsible for that insurance. So the strength of this model is groups may focus on the area of expertise, because we know some community groups have a very strong area of expertise, and this gives them the option to work just on that skill set. It also can be scaled up and scaled down depending on the event. So as I mentioned before, some councils are looking at that scalable approach where they may utilise a council model, Model 1, and then if it's a bigger event, they may look at scaling up into a Model 3. One of the challenges, though, is coordination and agreement is required from all of the groups of the consortium. And once again, that potential cost of insurance. So each organisation would need to cover the cost for their own volunteers. So this can be a lot on some of those smaller community organisations.
So just to real quickly, because we can see we're running out of time, so we'll touch on some examples of what has been emerging. So up in Far North Queensland, there is a small rural council that has engaged with a number of church groups for the management of spontaneous volunteers. Now, each of those church groups will play a significant role within each of their communities. So I think from memory, there were 5 church groups sitting at the table, and each of those church groups agreed to take on the responsibility of managing spontaneous volunteers, and they upskilled or skilled up their congregation or their members around team leadership of spontaneous volunteers, and they were each located in the various townships in that council area. So each of those areas, each of those church groups were working together, and also identifying ways that they could come together, like if one of the communities was more impacted and the other communities weren't impacted, they were having conversations about how each church group could come into the community to support. We're also seeing an emerging model with the roles of volunteer resource centres playing a significant role. We have a number of volunteer resource centres within Queensland. One at the moment has a real interest in playing in the disaster space, and we can see capacity for that organisation, and I believe there's interest as well, for them to play a dual role. One would be around the management of a small group, or depending on how many spontaneous volunteers they could look after. The other would be in a coordination role in terms of how they can support and coordinate the running of a consortium. So that is still under development, but I think that will grow as time progresses. There's also another council that is looking at utilising their community halls. So what we know in a number of these within this one LGA area, there might be 4 community halls. Those community halls, I was just told there's a lot more. So those community halls are already the hub for their community. So they're the area where these community groups or individuals affected by disasters will just go to. It's not a formal role these community halls undertake, it's just something that naturally happens in that space. And the council is currently working on ways to formalise that role and find ways that the community halls and their incorporated committees can take on a bit more of a role around the management of spontaneous volunteers. In terms of, so this is where we just get into the planning considerations. So for us, there are a few things that are a few learnings for us, and a few recommendations that we would like to make around planning for the use of spontaneous volunteers in your localities. One is we always talk to councils and their local community, particularly the local organisations, about understanding their local arrangements. Which means it's about understanding what's going to be happening in your local community, how the state will support your local arrangements, and about where they fit in, so they get a better understanding of that. It's also about engaging with the local organisations first. So you're not going to know what capacity and capability your local organisations have without asking the questions. So Volunteering Queensland, we do a capability and capacity assessment, and in doing that we look at things, we ask some questions about their membership. So based on volunteer practices, so if they were cleaning out a house, there might be a 1 team leader to 5 spontaneous volunteers. If they were outside clearing land where all volunteers were in a line of sight, there might be 1 volunteer to 10 spontaneous volunteers. So the reason why we ask the organisations about their membership is it's to get a good idea about their capacity to be able to support. Some of these community organisations might only have 5 members, and 2 of those might only have a genuine interest. So in a small community where they might only have to manage 10, 20 volunteers, that might work, but in a larger community it may not. We also ask them questions about what their core business is, and that question isn't about ruling them out from playing in that space. It's about understanding where they currently sit, what their knowledge is, and what kind of information and training they're going to need to get them skilled up to be in that space. And I'm going to go back to we always ask them about their insurance. I'm sorry, yeah. The other thing we ask you to do is engage with external organisations, and the importance of that is knowing what your options are if you need to increase the local capacity, particularly if the local community doesn't have the capacity to do that. Establishing the relationships before a disaster event is much easier than doing it on the run. When I spoke before about insurance, so for us there's 3 things we ask organisations to consider. One is making sure that they have public liability insurance. The other is having personal accident cover for your volunteers. We often, in the past, have dealt with comments or statements about, but there's a Civil Liability Act. So there's a protection clause in that. We always come back to that doesn't necessarily protect the organisation that has the volunteer, and nor does that give the volunteer any way of claiming back if there's any injury.
So just to continue with a few more considerations. So once you've understood your local arrangements, you've engaged with your local workforce and local organisations and some of the external organisations, what the next step would be to identify the model that best suits your community. So this may take some time to plan and to think about what it is that your community needs during a disaster. Thinking about what roles may be needed and who is the best place to lead those volunteers. So after you've thought about that, the next step is to formalise that model by establishing MOUs and formalising those plans and partnerships before the event. We also need to make sure that we develop standard operating procedures that will outline how spontaneous volunteers will be managed in that community. And then finally, to embed those practices through exercises. This can be in the form of both desktop and face-to-face exercises. It's really important then to skill up team leaders and the organisations that will assist you, so that you have confidence that the team leaders will be managing those volunteers, that they have appropriate training in volunteer management practices and also any other relevant training. As a registered training organisation, Volunteering Queensland is able to help provide you with some of that if required. And finally, we look at promoting ways your local community can help throughout the year. And so this can be done through advertising volunteer opportunities in the community. And we know that once people start volunteering in a spontaneous disaster capacity, often they want to stay on and help with that organisation in the long term. So it does bring that social capacity a lot higher. So that's it from Amanda and us. We look forward to answering some of your questions.
Okay, thank you guys. There's been a bunch of good questions come through. Okay, so, and some of the questions that were posed a little earlier in the presentation, you might have covered off on them partly through the presentation, but I'll ask them anyway in case you want to elaborate or add anything further to them. So just to kick off then, there were a few questions about arrangements with the state government. So I'll ask this kind of sort of 3 questions together, just so that I can then turn my mic off. So you might want to grab a pen, guys, to just maybe jot them down. The first one was about, does the state government pay for the EV crew service? And there was also a question just asking about what formal agreements you have with Queensland Government to outline roles and responsibilities. So is there an MOU or something similar? And then another highly related question was about how involved state government has been, particularly with respect to funding. So I'll just pop your mic back on so that you can answer.
Thank you, Blythe. Okay, so in terms of EV crew service and are we paid, we are normally, with the EV crew service, we normally recoup our expenses after the disaster event. So we do our best to recoup what we can through our arrangements with Queensland Government. There is a misconception in Queensland that we are funded hundreds of thousands of dollars for the operation of EV crew, and that's actually incorrect. We do get, so within Queensland, we have an agreement with Department of Communities, who is our funder, but they fund us for a range of services. So we are recognised in Queensland as the peak. So in reality, when it comes to the formal agreements that we have in place, the formal agreement we have is in terms of our service agreement, which covers off maybe a list of 10 key services that we provide. And one of those services highlights that Volunteering Queensland operates EV crew at times of disasters. So, and that's the reference point for Queensland Government. But we're certainly not paid millions of dollars or hundreds of thousands or even tens of thousands. When it comes to funding, we have not been successful. It has been a really hard slog for us to be able to secure or be recognised in terms of, you know, it does cost us money to maintain. So at the moment, EV crew is maintained. We have, it's absorbed by a lot of the work that we currently do within EV crew, not the projects are clearly funded, but in terms of EV crew work, it is absorbed, most of it's absorbed by the organisation as it currently stands. And I did touch on the formal agreement. So our formal agreement with state is in the shape of a service agreement. So that's an agreement that most non-government organisations have with state government when we are funded to do undertake certain activities.
Oh, did I cut you off? I might have taken your mic off a little bit early. Sorry. If you need me to turn it back on, Amanda and Katherine, just let me know in the chat and I'll make sure I switch it back on for you. So I'm just kind of swapping back and forth. There was another question early on in the presentation just about who you or what groups you classify as recognised organisations. So for example, if Rotary had a role in assisting with moving furniture out of a flooded area, would they be classified as a recognised organisation? So I guess what kind of criteria you use to classify who's recognised?
Thanks, Blythe. So for us, again, we always go back to the local arrangements. It is about, when we talk about formally recognised, it's about those organisations that have been recognised as playing a significant role in their community, and that's normally been recognised by council, or that might be also come from state down, so state government will also give us that direction, but we always work with local government, and that's about making sure that we're working within the coordinated response. So if there is an organisation that's working outside of the coordinated response, we tend not to do that. But if we hear that there's an organisation wanting to work in that space, particularly at times of disasters, we will feed that information back into local and state government, and we are either, you know, we'll be given direction for how we proceed from there.
Great, thank you. Okay, I had another question about, so this is about the EV crew service and just around what happens during peacetime. So through the EV crew service, is there work done with organisations outside of disaster times to ensure that they've got things like correct insurance in place, or would that depend on the model? So would councils or another organisation have that kind of role?
So I think that's a lot of the work that I'm actually doing in the NDRP project at the moment. So once a council has worked out what models they're going to be going forward with, we look at having that MOU with them, so Volunteering Queensland and the council, or Volunteering Queensland and the organisation that they choose to use. And this MOU and our agreements that we have will outline the fact that they will need to have proper insurances and proper volunteer management practices in order for us to release the data through to them. So in terms of, we're a very limited organisation in terms of staff, so to get information with every council is quite difficult, but the councils that we are working through, we're definitely going and making sure that the organisations that they choose will have those appropriate insurances and appropriate volunteer management practices in place. Because we won't send information through, the names through to organisations that don't have those.
And thank you, Kat. And the information that we do provide councils, and particularly for any Queensland councils that are online now, Volunteering Queensland, we are always here, so you can always call us and ask us questions and we'll do our best to support you. A lot of that will be over the phone. When it comes to us, so there is some work that we do think needs to occur, and we can do a bit of work on the ground, but that is a fee-for-service model based on, and again, when we look at the funding, what we were funded to do, we haven't been funded to do that, and it is a small team. So we're always there to offer our support, but it is a fee-for-service model. The other thing I want everybody to know, particularly in Queensland, in reality, Volunteering Queensland is ready to respond. So the EVCrew database, the registration, so again, it's about the registration of volunteers, and it's about how we mobilise those volunteers to organisations that can manage those volunteers. We are ready to go, and it has overwhelming capacity to manage multiple activations. So, at times of disasters, even if we haven't entered those formal partnerships, give us a call and we're here for you. We are always here.
Because we do have a lot of volunteers signed up from a range of local government areas. So just because we don't have a formal MOU at this current point doesn't mean that we don't have volunteers from different local government areas.
Great, thank you. We've had a couple of questions from perspective of council, so I'll just ask you two questions together just so I can hand back over to you. One was just wanting to confirm how a council uses EVCrew. So in the model where council is the coordinator, if the council then direct people to register through EVCrew, and so would council then list the jobs and how many people they need, and is EVCrew able to match volunteers with those specific jobs? And then a second question from council perspective is, what about people who turn up at council offices not aligned with an organisation? Is there information or things ready that councils can use at point of contact with individuals who rock up?
So I think answering the second question first is probably a little bit easier. So people that turn up at council, if we already have a process in place, so we know who's going to manage those spontaneous disaster volunteers, there's a place to refer them to. So whether or not that's council or whether or not that's another organisation. So if we've already got an agreement in place and a process has already been set up, we would then be able to refer those people through to EVCrew to register online, or it's also possible through a paper form. And they would then be able to register on the spot for EVCrew and then be able to nominate the shifts that they would like to undertake. In terms of how a council uses EVCrew, so the way it's happened for us in the past, I can sort of run you through a little bit of how it would work. So a council would request that we utilise, that they would like to use some volunteers. We would then send them through an email, ask them questions about what they would like their volunteers to do, what time they would like them to turn up, how many volunteers they would need. They would then send us all that information back to us. So we would then know that they might want 50 volunteers a day to turn up at 8:30 a.m. to 2:30 p.m. outside the council offices. We would then send an email out to all our registered EVCrew people in that local government area and ask them to register for those shifts. So we would put on our EVCrew system relevant shifts. So there may be, for a week, we've got 50 people turning up at 8:30 and only 50 people then can actually sign on to those shifts. So once we once they've signed on, we would then send them an email with all the relevant information, and then those volunteers would hopefully turn up at 8:30 a.m. the next morning and be ready for their shift.
So moving on, so fleshing that out a bit more too, in terms of how council uses EV Crew and its processes, if council can see if you've entered into arrangements with organisations on the ground for the management of spontaneous volunteers, if you can see you're going to need spontaneous volunteers, really it's as quick as calling us. And then we do have some paperwork. So if you're going to take on the management of spontaneous volunteers, there is some paperwork that you need to fill out, and that's asking about insurances and who's the key person and what activities are they doing. It's a fairly simple form. It's not a massive form that you need to fill out, and pretty much we do the rest for you. So if you tell us what days you're operating, how many people you need, we will do all the work, source them for you, and we will send it to you. One of the benefits of utilising EV Crew, and in particular when we can see the bigger events unfolding, and we were certainly watching up in North Queensland, one of the benefits of EV Crew is it is a central point of registration. So it means that the messages that are provided to Queenslanders, it's clearer. You don't have multiple registration points. If people are turning up at council, one of the things that we're working on in the back end, and we will be sharing that with people, we are talking about the importance of communicating with people even before a disaster event unfolds. It's important to start to engage with the community about what may be expected they will, if they're going to be required, or how they start to volunteer in their local community now before a disaster unfolds, so they can volunteer with an affiliated group that most likely will be supporting the disaster event. So there is a range of work that we are working on, but the messages is really important. And if you've got people turning up saying they want to help, and you don't know where to refer them to, we can then work with you on that at the time about how we fix those messages up to either settle down the flow that you're getting, or how to set up a registration centre, and we start to register them and refer them to the organisations that can use them.
I think a lot of the time people turn up at the council buildings or start Facebook groups and turn up in the council areas because they don't have an avenue where they know that they can help. So by providing them with that good messaging, as Amanda's just spoken about, it gives them that avenue to know where that they can help. So hopefully that would limit the supply, I suppose, better word, of those volunteers.
And Blythe, I've just seen one question pop up about if EV Crew are registering spontaneous volunteers, are they under their insurance? Volunteering Queensland does not insure spontaneous volunteers. The online portal is almost like a job placement organisation. So we ask for the basic skills, we ask for basic information about that volunteer, and that it's the organisation who we are referring to, it's their responsibility. They insure the volunteer, they look after the volunteer, they assess if the volunteer is fully capable of undertaking the duties. Remember, we don't get to eyeball them, we don't get to see them. This is just people expressing interest in volunteering, and we're sending them to you.
So I'll ask another two questions just to limit the back and forth of the microphones. I had a question about, and this was why you were discussing, I think, Model 2, is if the organisations deploy at different times, and do you split capacity at all into short-term versus long-term recovery support? And then there was another question sort of along a similar vein, on a tangent, but is how you would engage with EV Crew volunteers at the time that they're not actually activating, so in quiet times.
So I'll answer the question in terms of how we engage EV Crew volunteers. So we do send them emails, so we do a regular email every year to make sure, so we send them an email asking them to update their details. And then sometimes people will come back and say, please remove me from EV Crew, I'm no longer interested in being a volunteer. That's fine, we do that. But we always do engage with them once a year as we lead into storm season to ascertain their availability. EV Crew volunteers are also engaged, really, because in Queensland we have, we seem to be the disaster state sometimes. So they are actively engaged most of the time in terms of giving them, so as the Townsville event unfolded, we were getting a lot of inquiries, but even from people in Brisbane, Gympie, wanting to be deployed up to Townsville. So what we would do is communicate with those volunteers. We would send them, all the volunteers, emails to say, here's an update on what's happening at the moment in Townsville. Really glad, it's awesome that you're interested in volunteering, but at the moment you're not required. So we do actively engage with those volunteers in peacetime as well as at time of, at wartime. I shouldn't say at time of war, but you know what I mean. Some of the conversations we are having with councils, so when we do look at the data of the councils that are registered on EVCRU within Queensland, it's a database of about 65,000 people that are registered. So the conversations we're having with councils at the moment, with some of the councils, is saying, look, you've got 20,000 people registered to volunteer in your council area. This is a great opportunity for council to start to provide Volunteering Queensland and EVCRU with messages about what they think is going to happen in their community this disaster season. So we are trying our best to explore ways to utilise EVCRU in a I guess more effectively in terms of how we communicate. Now there was another question, and because I'm a big talker, I've forgotten what that question is. I'm so sorry, Blythe.
That's okay. It was a question about, sorry, I'll just mute you there, about splitting capacity of organisations between short and long-term recovery and organisations deployed at different times.
Okay, all right. So that's about the use of volunteers.
I suppose in the projects that I'm working in, especially in the consortium, that I suppose allows a bit of flexibility with those organisations coming in, because there are multiple organisational groups in that consortium, they are able to start at different times if need be and come in when the need is greater. And I think, as we said before, it may be that they start off with the council organisation managing those spontaneous disaster volunteers, and then move on to another organisation, or bring in another organisation that they would like to manage those spontaneous volunteers. And that can happen as long as they've got those arrangements with those organisations beforehand.
And certainly in the town, and we'll use Townsville because that's the most recent and fresh event in our mind. What did happen is those, like even if those organisations were working, I think there were 4 in total that we were working with, including ourselves. Volunteering Queensland pulled spontaneous volunteers from that database. One of the things, so each of those organisations activated at different points in time. So we were, and the way that our system is set up, we can pretty well set that up at any point. That doesn't really matter. But I think a lot of those arrangements need to be organised, you know, discussed locally so that they know at what point they're going to be needing people. But for EVCRU, we can do that. One of the greatest challenges we did have with EVCRU, and that's about the interest of spontaneous volunteers, it really does start to die off after a few weeks. So while we were communicating with volunteers on a daily basis, we were sending them emails saying these shifts are available, are you available, can you support? What we noticed was that died off significantly, and it was by week 4, it was really hard. And even for we were working close with Team Rubicon, towards the end there, we were only sending them 2 volunteers a day, and it was really tough for us to recruit. Particularly in that, again, with EVCRU, one of the things we do is we only recruit volunteers from a local community. So for the Townsville event, we were advised that there wasn't accommodation, it was going to be very difficult. So we quarantined, so we only engaged with the Townsville people about shifts that were available, and everybody else that had registered that were external to Townsville, we engaged with them differently, and that was about providing them with clear information about, there wasn't, you know, accommodation, and at the moment they wouldn't be required. And that did create some challenges as well. Some people were really upset that their support wasn't being utilised. But that's the kind of messaging that we provide. But these organisations can be activated at different points of time, but it is very hard to engage those volunteers in the longer term.
Great, thank you so much. You'll see I've popped up a little survey there. I should have put up a bit early for the people that were logging off at 4. I'll probably call time on questions at the moment so that I don't need to keep Amanda and Katherine for any longer. But just to let you know, any questions that you've posed that haven't yet been answered, I will send them to Amanda and Katherine by email. And get some responses from them that way, and you'll have a link where you'll be able to access responses to those questions. Feel free, or please do fill out our webinar survey. This really helps us in understanding how useful the webinars are being for people. And I just wanted to say a huge thank you to Amanda and Katherine. There's obviously a lot of interest in this area, and I think this is one topic where we particularly benefit from sharing experience and knowledge at the moment, as a lot of organisations are thinking about what they need to do in planning for spontaneous volunteers. So that has been brilliant, and we really appreciate your generosity in sharing your time with us. I have you on mute, so you can't say anything to respond to that. I'll pop your mic back on in a second for you to say goodbye to us. But I just wanted to say thank you everyone as well for attending today and for your great questions, and we hope that the webinar's given you some food for thought to help you in your own planning and thinking around spontaneous volunteers. And I'll just pop the mic on for you guys to say goodbye as well.
Thank you so much, Blythe. It's really good that we've had so many great questions today, because it is something that I think a lot of councils are starting to think about. So if you do have any other questions, please feel free to get in touch with us, and we look forward to answering all your questions.
And I think, and thanks again, Blythe, for including us. In terms of, if you do have questions, get in contact. And we're actually really keen. It's not just about questions. If you see particular challenges with some of our models, if there's things that you feel that we haven't considered in the projects that we're doing, we're really interested and keen on getting that feedback so that we can really make sure that this is as strong as it possibly can be, and also extremely useful to the organisations and the resources that we produce as a result. So thank you very much, everybody.